Hello everyone and welcome to my last ever presentation. The aim of this presentation was to, instead of focusing in one particular software, try to rather cement my learning and see whether I can put this to the test and make a demo podcast for my graduation project. I utilized my plan of action that I created all the way back in my first ever presentation to ensure that every step of my production process was carried out effectively, repeatedly asking myself whether the quality was up to scratch and consistently placing myself in the shoes of the audience to identify fallacies and mistakes. In terms of sources, then I have looked mainly at three types of references, being Adobe Max 2020, YouTube tutorials, and Adobe forums for user input. Since this week's presentation is going to shift continuously between softwares, I won't go into each individual source. Instead, I will be showing this at which point do I use them through in-text citations. As to when usage is concerned, I used Adobe Max 2020 sessions as a means to proper get introductions into areas of the softwares I didn't know. I used YouTube tutorials for more specific learning features and techniques that I wouldn't necessarily learn from just Adobe's sessions. And finally, I use Adobe Forums whenever I need an answer to precise errors and issues. It's better, I believe, to use user input here because it's just simpler, more efficient to get solutions from others who had already had a similar problem like yours. The first step of the production process for my podcast was to create a script which was easy to access between my co-host Pablo and myself. I used Adobe InDesign for this. Whilst it is not necessary, I'm a fan of making things look good. If they are looking good, then subconsciously it's easier for me to devote more time to it and focus in making the thing actually reach a certain level of quality. I also managed to include timestamps and the cover photo for the episode that were going to be utilized for when they are eventually uploaded into the respective podcast platforms. One of the skills that I learned in InDesign is that actually exporting settings let you create templates. This is a way that before I create a new file and I could already use this as a template instead of having to create one from scratch. So every time now that I want to make a new script, I just open the template that I have already made. Moreover, I finally learned to use the CC libraries and dynamic project settings so that everyone working on the podcast and in my graduation project can access the files from their locations and simultaneously work on the script or any documentation by that matter. They have full access to the photos and color palettes that I have set for the branding of the podcast. Moving on to the second step of the project, I had to do the recording of the actual audio. For this, I trekked back again into using Adobe Audition. In contrast to the previous time that I utilized it, this time around I learned how to record using the multi-track workspace. Basing myself on the feedback that I received a weeks prior, I moved from Audacity, which is a free editing software, to actually Audition, where now I feel more comfortable within the multi-track sessions. One thing that I learned is the use of a normalizer, since most of the time I would just work with my own microphone and now I have two different inputs. A normalizer helps me keep a steady volume throughout, which just saves a lot of time when it comes to matching out the volume of a complete mixdown. Hello everyone, ¿cómo están? This is Luis Burga, but you can call me Burga. The third step was to use After Effects, where I wanted to make a new intro based on the learning that I made individually throughout the holidays. The first was masking, which provided more of a kind of time-consuming experience rather than actually difficulty, but it worked out perfectly. With the knowledge that I had prior on After Effects before, I managed to use the groups and compositions. By doing this, I essentially created a template that will allow me to change the images and the video footage depending on the episode of the topic that I wanted to make. Lastly, I endured a rather simple but ever so important importing and exporting process in Premiere Pro. An issue that at the time I didn't resolve, but now I need to go back and take a look at it, is that when I was compiling all the files, one of them were very large of a size to compare to others. Looking for a fix, I found out the audio spectrum waveform that I made in the previous presentation was actually of 80 gigabytes, which is just way too big. The issue was down to the codec and most importantly also to the targeted bitrate. I installed the H.264 codec in my computer afterwards because After Effects for some reason in my PC didn't have it. And I also learned that through the Adobe forums, for instance, pages like Dailymotion, Vimeo, and YouTube have set bit rates, and that being 8. So what I did was exporting next time with that, but I also needed to add a targeted bitrate that for when Premiere Pro had to use the use of motion graphics, they rendered it with that larger quality bitrate and then render it again in 8. So that made it a little bit of a time-consuming process, but it kept the quality. Ultimately, I am happy with the result of all of it, but in terms of production processes, I have made some improvements that I would like to do. And also, I will continue to work and monitor the feedback that I receive from both this presentation and the audiences and the listeners of the podcast. That will conclude my presentation, and thank you for listening. Here are my references.